it takes time, and it's not fair that it takes time. It's frustrating that it takes time. But if we want to come to an outcome, that's what it took, a strategy to get here. It's going to take a strategy to get out of it.
Welcome to Honestly Speaking, a safe place to be unsafe. Life commentary and dialogue from a biblical, logical, cultural, and comical perspective.
Welcome back to Honestly Speaking. As per usual, how are you doing? Hopefully you have a community that you are pouring into and that is pouring into you. I know a lot has been going on in our world. We have wars and rumors of wars, and there's so many things going on, even as it pertains to some of the main hot topic issues, especially CRT. I'm excited to be wrapping up this interview that took place about a little over a month ago with myself and my good friend, Dr. Sarah Brubaker, who has studied CRT for well over 6 years. Please remember that this is just an introduction to the topic of CRT for those who wanted to learn more. So if you haven't seen part 1 and part 2, please make sure you do so, and like, share, and subscribe. And please leave a comment because it helps with the algorithm. In this episode, we'll get into how CRT is deliberately being mischaracterized. We'll also talk about some of church history and solutions and even resources for individuals in the church who want to learn more about CRT. It's also important to note that some of the resources that we will be recommending are not direct CRT theorists. Okay, they are not critical race theorists. However, their works deal with many of the issues that CRT attempts to address. Again, this is just wrapping up an introduction discussion. I highly recommend a few other podcasts that go into this if you want to talk more about CRT in the church. So with that being said, let's get into it. This is part 3 of CRT with an Ed D.
Strategy to get here. It's going to take a strategy to get out of it.
Why do you think evangelicals, or certain evangelicals, not all, right, are like saying the things that they're saying about CRT, or are avoiding the topic of race or approaching it through this bash CRT lens?
Right. So I think that we need to be, like you mentioned, careful to identify and acknowledge that there's a wide variety of nuances to this answer from evangelicals as a whole, especially white evangelicals. They're not monolithic. And I think too, like, to underline this, the many answers to this question is that just like people of color in general have experienced society as raced, white people do too. We just aren't aware of it, right? Like we just don't know it until something forces us to know it. So I think in terms of a societal level, part of this comes from just being ignorant. And I know that we have Google and there's no excuse for white people to not know or to be ignorant. But I think that we do need to acknowledge at least that there are really manipulative, strategic narratives and sanitized words that are being used over and over and over again for the construction of socialized oppression and racism. And so then people think they're okay, right? Like this idea of, we live in a meritocracy, so you need to work hard just like I worked hard. I don't want to just give you a handout. Like, that sounds good, but the reality is we're not talking about the same factual underscore of what reality is, right? So I think that, like, it's important to remember that there has been a very specific emphasis on white people not knowing about race and not being able. There's a reason it went covert, essentially, right? And so I think that that's important to remember. I think part of it comes from guilt and from the inability or the lack of desire to actually deal with these issues, right? Like, we can't conceive of ourselves in this sense. Robin DiAngelo, I think, hits this on the head in her White Fragility book, where she talks about white people see being racist as binary. You're either racist or you're not. And we try everything we can to show that we're not racist. when the reality is it's a spectrum, and we move back and forth during different situations and at different times in our life, and as we develop our racial identity awareness, right? So I think that even
so some people are bi racist.
They're bi racist. Yes, that's exactly right. Maybe they're. I was gonna make another joke, but I don't think I should. But yes, so then when we feel like we are being called racist, it's this racist bad, non-racist good, rather than kind of this like spectrum in between. And I think furthermore, we can't conceive of even the guilt of the United States in this sense, right? For many white people, the United States has been amazing, right? Like, and so again, there's not really a benefit to acknowledge all of the atrocities of what the United States has done and continues to do. I think even with the Alamo, right? Like we have to, there's part of that in there. There's this epic of wanting to be this like always on the right, and the right side of history. I can't say always on the right, always on the right side of history, and always, being the ones who are fighting for justice, and we are democracy. And I think this idea that the US is not just complicit, but like on purpose, like responsible for these things, I think is really hard for a lot of white people to actually like conceive of. You mentioned this before, Lee, the fact that there's such a proximity to oppression that comes here, right? As white people, generally, we don't have to engage with it. Like white people don't think about race apart from certain instances because they don't have to, right? Like this goes back to the idea that fish who are wet don't realize they're wet. And I think that's one of the reasons why when George Floyd was murdered there was this change kind of, and I think it was a whole combination of things, but I think also like white people just don't have to think about it. That's part of white privilege, right? And I know that term is like, like a heated term and whatever, but the idea of being able to go home and not have to think about how my race impacts my day, or how it's going to impact my day tomorrow, or how it's going to impact my relationships, that's a huge aspect of white access and white privilege, right?
Can I say this really quick? I think that did you want to finish your point?
No, go ahead. That's basically it.
So I think I even have an example of this for those who think that like somehow like we're just trying to just say this is a white person issue. What I'm saying is this is the issue of anybody who is in a position of power, yes. Right? So I remember the first time I went to Africa, right? And I was in Senegal, and I was in a home. We stayed with people in homes, and I was in a home, and this the daughter of the home, me and her were busting it up. She was cool, and this is actually the reason why I love languages. People who know me know I love languages, but they don't know this is the reason why. So this young lady, she's talking to me, and her mom speaks English. I don't speak French, right? I spoke un peu, like petit un peu français, like very little French. So she's trying to talk to me and I didn't understand. So she switches from French, then she speaks Arabic. And I didn't even know Arabic at the time enough to say Layarif. I didn't know, right? Then she goes to Wolof. Then she goes to Mandingo. But by the time she got to the fourth language, her look on her face was one of disgust and bewilderment. Like, what? Like, I tried 4 to 5 different languages to communicate to you, and you didn't know any of them? And all I could say was, I'm an American. I never had to.
I didn't need to, yeah.
I didn't need to. I didn't need to learn these other languages. I didn't need to, which goes, and it's so funny because it ironically feeds into the stereotype that colonialists have used when they colonize other countries, so that when people come here, especially first generation individuals who migrate here, they excel because they have this drive, because they think that Americans are lazy. And it's not that we're lazy. We don't even know to know other people's cultures.
Yeah.
So that is to Sarah's point. And I'm saying this as a Black person that realized this when I went to Africa, that I couldn't even connect with people that I am from, essentially, because I had the privilege my entire life of never having to have to learn another language and know that the US dollar was the strongest and that everything bowed down to my particular nation's currency.
That's right.
However, it still created a chasm between me and somebody who was trying to communicate with me.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that. And and I'm gonna be honest, it was a bit of shame, frustration, and anger that I felt when that happened, because I felt like I should know, which I probably should have. I did have Spanish class that I fell asleep in, that I was probably high in, right? But they weren't even speaking Spanish.
Right.
Right. But I also felt like somebody should have taught me this, and they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a mutual frustration.
Right.
And then I felt like, wow, I can't communicate, and I don't even have the history to even know where my group of individuals are from to even try to reach for a tribal language to connect to them.
Mm-hmm.
So it was all of that in crescendoing into one moment that made me say, from now on, when I meet somebody who is of a different language, I'm going to try to learn at least how to say hello or whatever. And so now I know like well over 25 languages, ways to say hello, and well over 25 different languages, right? And that is from the privilege of being an American. And I'm still a Black woman in America.
Right.
So if I had rich white man privilege, I probably would feel real bad if somebody started to say something.
Right.
I just would.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, especially your last point, I think that is how many white people feel when trying to have this conversation, is
right.
that feeling of, and you have to get past it. Like you have to be able to like own it and then like move past it, move forward, because the chasm of relationship is just going to get bigger if there's no movement forward.
And can I say this too? With all of the Tabitha Brown I have in my soul.
Hello there.
Right? I'm just going to say this as beautifully, eloquently, and graciously as possible. Part of accepting just or owning where we are is not by making it about us.
That's right. That's right.
You make it about you. You stay stuck there. And then two, you should be angry too.
That's right.
As a white American, you should be angry at the part of dehumanization that occurred not only to you, to them, to others, in the othering of folks, but to yourself.
That's right.
Because there is a callousness when you even have to otherize folks. Mm-hmm. The moment you don't see yourself in them, you've already lost a part of your humanity. And that should make you angry at whatever has caused you to not see yourself in other people when you look at them. And that's where it touches on the spiritual aspect. Yeah. Because that is evil. That's very quite literally demonic.
Yes.
So I don't care if it's a person of color. I don't care if it's a trans person. I don't care if it's a person who has a disability. If you cannot see your humanity in them and their humanity in you, you have lost a part of your humanity. Right. And so part of the reason why it's on my heart to have these conversations, these courageous and dangerous conversations with white folk, is not because I want the freedom for everybody, but I also want for white folks to gain the part of their humanity that they lost in that transaction. That makes sense?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Yeah. And that idea that happens, like you mentioned earlier, by proximity, right? The research shows that currently in the United States, that we are more segregated in some places than we were before desegregation. And so the vast amount of, this was one of the things I found in my own research, the vast amount of white folks come from incredibly homogenous backgrounds, both racial and political. And let's just call it what it is. Those two things intersect in a way that's really unique. And so that part of then the attacks that particularly white evangelicals have against CRT is the fact that they have never been in proximity to needing CRT, right? To having someone that they know and love and see being impacted by these things that need to have, you know, a flashlight shined on them, which CRT can do. Yeah. I think part of the fear, again, we mentioned this a little earlier, that I think that we need to recognize like the psychology of fear and propaganda and the use of that. And I think that we, you know, like myself in particular, I can watch certain groups of white folks say and do certain things and be like, what in the world are you, like, how is this even like a conception that like you should do or say or act this way? And then you listen to the things that they're being told and the ways in which like truth and fear and lies are all being like braided together with like fear mongering, all different types of fallacies, this fear of society being zero sum, right? If you get more, then I get less. And the combination of that with like this caricature of CRT, misinformation, right? Like we only listen to people that we agree with. It's confirmation bias, source bias, right? And then I think, of course, you have people who are genuinely white supremacists, and, you know, everybody else, like, you know, maybe it's unintentional, not an excuse. Like that's the impact, right? Alexander Jung wrote this incredible book called Whiteout, and he talks about we need to be done excusing intention, right? I didn't mean to say it. I didn't mean it like that, right? The impact is what matters, not the intention. And going back to what you said, Leigh, we make it about us. So when I make it about the intention, I'm making it about what I was trying to communicate. When we make it about the impact, we're making it about the other person, right? And it, again, just highlights how incredibly self-centered and egocentric we can be. So that's like on a societal level, I think why. I think on a religious and a faith level, it's a whole different thing. I think the primary issue, one of the key arguments for years and years against social justice in general, which of course CRT is only the latest iteration and the characterization of it, is that it detracts from the gospel, right? For the vast, vast majority of church history, social justice was never separated from the gospel, ever. It was seen as the logical, natural outflow of the gospel. N.T. Wright would say that the Beatitudes in Matthew were not promises for the future. They were Jesus's kingdom agenda for today. And N.T. Wright highlights the fact that the phrase in the Lord's Prayer, "Let your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven," is the directive to bring about God's kingdom, justice and all, to right here and now. And yet, partially because of a result of the Enlightenment, some other things as well, we've separated, and wrongly so, the spiritual and the physical. There is well, he's dead now, but there was an anthropologist, a Christian anthropologist named Paul Hebert, and he wrote this, it was way ahead of its time in terms of like Christian missions. And it was all about contextualization of the gospel into different cultures. And he talked about how one of the difficulties we have is that in the West, being influenced by the Enlightenment, behaviorism, modernism, all those things, we have separated the spiritual and the religious, and he calls it the flaw of the excluded middle. And so what we put in the middle ends up being like religion, essentially. And so these two things are separate. What we do on earth is separate from the spiritual, right? And N.T. Wright talks about like, no, we have allowed this misinterpretation of passages to give us an excuse to not be responsible Christians today because we're only thinking about eternity, right? So when Paul talks about in Colossians 3, and he says, that we need to set our minds on the things above, not on the earthly things. In our post-Enlightenment modern minds, we talk about like you're talking about the contextualization earlier of like the trumpets. The same thing with that. We look at that word and we're like, oh, beyond, right? Like this is eternity. It's like a different time. And N.T. Wright says, no, the actual word means, or it's above. We use the word above, but it's above, actually beyond, right. Meaning like the context of what God's kingdom agenda is and not what the earthly agenda is, right? And I think that like, that's really how the early church understood it. And I would go so far as to say that we have inverted this to the point that we are, by not focusing on social justice as adjacent to the gospel, we are focusing on earthly agenda and not on kingdom agenda, because we have misinterpreted and I don't think that that's been by accident, by the way. We have misinterpreted these ideas. We are now doing the complete opposite of what we think we're doing. But up until Reconstruction, essentially in the late 1800s, social justice was a very normalized part of the church, not just like individual people, but the church as a whole. So at that point, of course, slavery was alive and well and ingrained in us, and very alive and well in the white church. We can see the Southern Baptist, I'm just gonna call it what it is, the Southern Baptist Convention. From then until now, you want to read their manifesto against social justice and kicking CRT out of the Southern Baptist Convention, like that's fine, but
over 179
pages. Yep. And I would, and they don't even just say CRT, they say critical theory in general. So essentially they're saying, just don't ask questions. That's what they're saying. So anyways, I have a whole issue with the SBC for lots of reasons, like deal with racism, child sex abuse, misogyny, whatever. But anyway, there's been a really strategic parsing and the Southern Baptist Convention of what the gospel and the church was responsible for and what they were not responsible for. And this led to an incredible fracture between those who wanted to include justice in the identity of Jesus, concurrent with scripture, and those who did not. And so we've parsed it to where now you have the majority of evangelicals, white conservative evangelicals, from the time that they were young or the time that they began being involved in the church, being told that the gospel is 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4, right? That Jesus died on the cross, that he was buried, and that according to the scriptures, he rose again on the third day. And that's it, right? We've interpreted the gospels, AKA Jesus, and what he said and did through Paul, and not the other way around. And N.T. Wright brings us home. Y'all can tell I have a huge bias towards N.T. Wright. By the way, N.T. Wright mentions, he has said numerous occasions and has been disowned by many evangelical Christians for saying this, that he believes that in each like era, there's going to be an issue that God holds the church primarily accountable for. And he believes that in our era, it's going to be issues regarding race and the wealth disparity. That those are his things. So anyways, so N.T. Wright initially was a Pauline scholar, and now he would identify more as a New Testament scholar. And he has said from his own personal experience, we, particularly in the West, we read Paul and then we interpret Jesus through Paul, not the other way around. We don't interpret Paul through Jesus. So you see how we've like screwed this whole thing up for ourselves, right?
And it's true. And it goes to your original point, or for our younger viewers, it's like a filter, right? So we're on social media and we like filters. We're saying that the way Christians have been taught to think, it has the filter built into the app. Mm-hmm. CRT does is it removes the filter. So that way you can see certain parts of yourself. Now, here's the thing, but the Bible is the ultimate filter remover. The problem is we don't even realize that our current view of the Bible is through the filter that was already on it.
Right, that's right.
So CRT is like saying, hey, look at how you're looking at this particular thing.
Right, that's right.
I want you to just give a list of individuals that you think people should study, for CRT, and then maybe from a Christian perspective, who are some of the people that we should be reading?
Yeah, so Mari Matsuda is she has worked very closely with Kimberlé Crenshaw, Richard Delgado. Derrick Bell is a huge name in CRT. Alan Freeman. They're kind of like the seminal authors. They have a couple books together that they've kind of compiled the basics of CRT. I think they wrote even an introduction to CRT. And then there's CRT in lots of different fields. So like for my own self, Adrian Dixon has written several books in CRT, particularly in education. Derrick Bell's The Faces at the Bottom of the Well was really one of the catalysts towards this. Robin DiAngelo is a white woman who wrote the book White Fragility. She does talk a little bit about CRT in terms of a lens, but it's not like an overview of CRT essentially. Right. Ibram X. Kendi, of course, and I think especially, so of course, like How to Be an Anti-Racist, but Stamped from the Beginning, I think is a really good book in terms of seeing kind of the internalized and the beginning, the impact and the internalization of that stuff. I'm trying to think of, those were, I think, the primary ones. And most of those people, again, this is relatively new, right? So 80s, 90s. So these people, many of them have lectures or discussions or TED Talks that you could probably find on YouTube as well. There's another resource that I think is really good. It's called Seeing White. It's a podcast it's on Scene on Radio. And it's not really about CRT, but I think combining CRT with understanding how white people see and experience race can be really strategic in knowing how to respond or how to deal with particularly white people who are, maybe going off about CRT. But he's a white man, and he has one of his, I believe actually he has a couple of his friends who are Black who kind of rotate. And they just talk about race on their podcast, and it's basically him learning about his whiteness and about like the world he's seeing, being white essentially for the first time.
First time, got you.
But yeah, so I think that there are a lot of another podcast I think that's really great is The Holy Post, and Lee, you and I have talked about The Holy Post before, because they bring on people that you wouldn't necessarily think immediately would be the ones that they're like not your first go-to maybe of people. They're maybe a little bit more obscure, but there are lots of other pastors. Jamar Tisby, obviously. I just actually was having a conversation with someone the other day about, and they said, well, he's become kind of political. And I'm like, right, because we've made race political. Like, he's not actually being political. This has now just become like a political thing. But so he would be really good. And again, I think too, like the other thing is that when I feel like I'm giving these endorsements of these people, and I just need to say, like, they are coming from their own lenses and their own experiences. And I think we in our society have gotten to, like, I'm going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So like, we don't agree with one thing that someone says, and like the entire thing that they're talking about, we just decide that we are not going to deal with that particular thing. Right. So Eric Mason is another one that has spoken particularly about systemic racial injustice. And so I think there's a couple, those are, and again, some of them are people that we might disagree with a couple things that they say or that they do, but they're the ones who are really kind of speaking out about these things. And I think in terms of Black pastors speaking out, that myself anyway, as a white Christian, there needs to be an amplification of these voices who are speaking from their own experience and their own understanding of those things. And again, throwing out all of the things that someone says, because, you know, I might not agree with one or two of them from my own personal experience or opinion, can be dangerous. But
I definitely think that Dr. Eric Mason's work when he did Woke Church is good. And his latest book, Urban Apologetics, is so good.
Really? I haven't read that. I've read Woke Church.
Good.
But
his book is literally a how-to reach guide people who have particular urban religious views that they don't teach you about in seminary. When you go to seminary, you don't know how to learn how to deal with Hebrew Israelites. You don't know how to deal with them. When you go to seminary, nobody teach you how to deal with people who worship Orishas or are in the traditional West African Yoruba religion. You don't learn how to do. You don't learn how to deal with Nation of Islam, Fruit of Islam, and that's literally what his book is talking about.
Right.
Like literally, and it's not. And this is the beautiful thing. It's not just him. He went and got a group of other scholars, and they all speak to the area in which they have experience and expertise. A new book that came out, I'm not through with it yet. That's not the name of the book. I'm just saying I'm not through with it yet. Is The Whitewashing of Christianity by Pastor Jerome Gay, I think his name is really good. Like, I mean, really, and rich. His references. Another book, this is not a Christian book, but it's called The Half Has Not Been Told. It's about the story of predatory capitalism in America and how it all stemmed from using chattel slavery of Black folks. So those are a few other good resources. Of course, W.E.B. Du Bois, The Soul of Black Folk. And even Frederick Douglass's autobiography. And the reason why I say that is because Frederick Douglass makes great distinctions between biblical Christianity, what we would call biblical Christianity now, and the Christianity of the slave master.
That's right. Huge distinction.
A huge distinction. And just another thing I want to say to my white brothers and sisters, the reason why Black folks, Black Christians in particular, want to talk about this is not so that we can harp on it. It's not so that we can have some huge power shift or whatever, because ultimately we recognize that if we could survive slavery, we could survive a lot, right? But it's so that we can have unity in the body, that God would be glorified, and that souls would be one, truly one, without having to make this compromise that Jamar Tisby spoke about, where we make this false delineation between God on earth and what happens in heaven. It's this Western, demonically inspired compartmentalization, and it's not godly. It's not godly, and it's not godly, and it's not loving. And so we lovingly, the Bible says, we're to lovingly bring these things up. And it doesn't mean that when we bring them up in love, that it's not with passion.
Right.
Jesus loved the Pharisees when he called them a brood of vipers. You know what I mean? He never not loved them. So I think that these things are important for evangelical purposes.
Yes.
And for the soul of the nation of the future that your children will live in and will inherit.
That's right. Yeah. And I think that these taking the time to read and to listen to these things are really, really valuable. I know, when I was first doing my research and writing my dissertation, I don't think she would mind me sharing this. My mom was gracious enough to read and edit my dissertation, and all, like 300 pages of it, not for the content, but she edited it for, sometimes what you're thinking, but it doesn't come out that way. And especially with academic writing, it can be like very erudite and like really like lofty and whatever. So it was helpful to have someone who's like, I don't even know what that means. But she really had a hard time about what I was writing and what I was learning. And we had lots and lots of conversations about, honestly, the accuracy of the information that I was presenting. And she had a really hard time. She was really gracious and still did it regardless. But she would tell you that was her first step into into thinking, being able to see systemic injustice, particularly systemic racism. And then maybe a year later, I think it was about a year later, my brother-in-law, one of my brother-in-laws, his best friend is Black. And after George Floyd was murdered, his best friend asked him to read Jamar Tisby's Color of Compromise. And he did, and it changed everything. So anyways, my mom went out to visit, and he started realizing that maybe his role in this was to try to talk to other white people about, because research shows that white people hear from white people typically more effectively about
most
issues
of us
regarding
do.
race. Right.
Most of us do. Black folk,
right.
we listen. Is the potato salad good? We're not. I'm going to ask another Black person. You may not even have. You could have the most Caucasian taste buds on the planet. I'm still going to say, is the potato salad good?
Right. Right.
Highly melanated.
That's right. That's right. So he started talking about it and said, you really should read this book. And she did. And just like with him, it like changed everything. And so now I don't think we ever hang out without her bringing it up or asking questions or wanting to talk about it. But all that to say, these resources can be really helpful. And I think it can be really disheartening. I'm not telling you or your especially Black listeners anything they don't know, obviously. Really disheartening to try to talk to white people about race, and saying that as a white person. But I think remembering and knowing that it takes time, and it's not fair that it takes time. It's frustrating that it takes time. But if we want to come to an outcome, that's what it took, a strategy to get here. It's going to take a strategy to get out of it. And so when we have conversations about CRT with people, I think particularly with evangelicals, that's a really big part of it, is knowing that it's a process, it's a stepping stone process. And when we look at racial identity awareness and the stages in it, and people go back and forth all the time, and it really is just, it takes, sometimes people get it and they're like, oh my gosh, I saw George Floyd being murdered, and I get it. Mm-hmm. They think they get it. We think we get it, right?
Like we think we get it, right? We're still learning too. Right?
Yeah. So, but those movements forward, it is happening. It is happening that there are white people who are heartbroken over the way that people of color, particularly Black people, have been treated and are being treated, and are being will be continued to be treated. And it is happening that there are people we are finally seeing what is happening. And it took us way too long. But having these conversations with people is hard, and it's painful. And I think that it's really important that white people, if you're a white person listening to this, that we need to recognize our role in this as well. And that it's time that people who are able to elevate voices, or who are able to educate without it having to come from the people who are constantly having to educate and constantly having to carry the emotional load of having these conversations. There is a place for us to do that as well. And these resources are really, really helpful. And I think also there's this, in the theory of learning, there's this idea that I think it's called the Dunning-Kruger curve, but it's this idea that the more you learn about something, you think you're an expert in it, until you get to a point and you realize, oh, I'm never going to know all this stuff. And then it goes back down. But we get to a point where we see something, we watch it, and we're like, oh, we get it, we know, right? And so I would just encourage, especially listeners who are white, to not get to that point, to not stop caring or reading or researching or asking questions, because we will never get to that point. And if we have the pride and the hubris of like, no, we know what's going on, and we don't need to listen to the people who are actually experiencing it, I think that's really dangerous. And these are resources that can really help us to avoid that happening.
Excellent. And also, I think it's difficult for not just white people to talk about it, but people who value whiteness.
That's absolutely right.
And do not value blackness, or actually are afraid of, turned off by, or despise blackness as a result. Not as a result, but it's difficult for them as well to talk about these things, because you can be a black person with internalized self-hatred or internalized whiteness. I'm not going to mention any names of prominent people who are getting paid a whole lot of money
in really prominent places,
and really prominent places, because they have to be the one in the room. And this comes back to me. This comes back to basic psychology of humans. You have people who compete for attention. You see it amongst people, like dating relationships. You'll have somebody says, I have to be the only blank in the room, or whatever. It's not just race that these things happen in, but it is important, just like Dr. Brubaker said, to be aware of the resources that we mentioned. And also, as Christians, I cannot stress it enough, for us to be able to be praying.
Yeah.
I was convicted because I had more hope for my Muslim father than I did for my Christian brother, who was opposing, and is still opposing, Dr. Eric Mason. I just was like, I'm done with him. Right. And then I got convicted, like, Liana, are you done with your father? Because your father's still not saved yet, Liana. Are you done with your father? So if you're not done with your father, how can you be done with your brother?
Right.
And so it let me know, again, it just made me think just how spiritual this particular battle is. We are dealing with old demons. For those who don't understand, there was a point in the scriptures in Daniel where Daniel was praying, and I think it's like in Daniel 10, I think, or 9. It was like the 21st day of his prayer, and Gabriel comes to him and says, the moment you began praying, we were on our way. But we got caught up in a scuffle with the prince of the air of Persia. Minute, y'all was fighting for 21 days with a whole different demonic force. There are principalities at play that depend on the divisiveness and for us to be divided Christians. And I think it's important that we pray specifically against them. I'm very deliberate when I say that there's 3 aspects for every major stronghold. It is the personal, it is the structural, and it is the spiritual. And we have to, as Christians, if we believe what the Bible is saying is true, then we are the ones who have to approach it on every level. We have to repent individually. We have to speak to truth to power structurally, and we have to make war in the spirit on the spirit.
Yeah. Amen.
Yep. So with that having been said, thank you so much, Dr. Brubaker. This supposedly it was going to be an hour. It ended up being 2 hours. Why? Because when friends get together and talk, and one of your friends is an expert in the thing that's the hot button topic, or is a budding expert, or has studied it to the degree that she knows.
Maybe we'll go with the last one.
Has studied it a whole heck of a lot more than the people who are criticizing it. Oh yeah, we had to talk. All right, so Sarah, could you take us out in prayer? Thank you.
Sure. Jesus, we come to you knowing that you had...
So let's wrap it up as we have been doing. What did we learn? In addition to the fact that we already spoke about how CRT is just a lens that attempts to identify how overt racism became covert, we also spoke about how many in the church historically are taught to see race as political in order to avoid engaging the pain and entering into the sufferings of others who bear the Imago Dei. And also because many in the church, especially the history in the West, actually benefited from the status that came from the creation of race and even the divisiveness. Therefore, it's important for us as the church to be praying all the more, because this battle is really spiritual. The enemy loves to divide. It's also important for us to study church history in order to not repeat old patterns and break certain sinful cycles, and war for unity in the body. We also need to war by realizing that everything in the church is not bad. Significant progress has been made, and even has been made by many in the church, to bring about racial unity and give dignity to all of God's creation. Thus, we need to be patient, understand that it will take time, repentance, and the Holy Spirit for us to address all of the disunity that came from the creation of race on a personal, structural, and spiritual level. So that's it, folks. And to my brothers and sisters who are not white or black, or they're somewhere in between, please note that this discussion was not meant or intended to leave you out. It is a starting point, because the creation of race was intended to divide, mainly between white and black. And now that those issues have been briefly spoken about, we want to talk a bit more about the complexities of race and the church. And also remember, all of the resources that were spoken in this do not subscribe to be critical race theorists, even though some of their works talk about the same issues that critical race theorists talk about. Once again, critical race theory is just a theory. It's not the devil, but it also ain't the answer. Have a great one, everyone. And remember, love God, love your neighbor, and take care of yourself. Oh yeah, and subscribe, like, share, and comment. Peace.